The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland. From the University of Maryland, this is Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff.
Developed countries all over the world are grappling with issues and problems raised by high levels of legal and illegal immigration. These countries face the interconnected challenges of protecting their borders, promoting immigrant assimilation, dealing with large and growing illegal populations, and balancing the need to protect native workers alongside the desire to attract high-skilled immigrants. As the U.S. prepares to overhaul its immigration system, what lessons can we learn from abroad? Joining us to discuss the current state of international immigration is Demetrios Papademetriou, president of the Migration Policy Institute and co-author of Immigration and America's Future, A New Chapter. And now, the host of Policy Watch, Doug Besheroff.
Demetrios Papademetriou, and I got it right. We're close enough. Welcome to Policy Watch in the University of Maryland.
It's my pleasure.
Actually, I should say welcome back, because you did receive your PhD from the University of Maryland, and then you taught at the University of Maryland. So it's a double pleasure to have you back. Your most recent book is Immigration and America's Future, A New Chapter. And I must say, I learned so much from it, both about the American immigration, but also how we fit into the world. And I'd actually like to start with a discussion about worldwide immigration. I think you told me when we were talking before that about 190, maybe 200 million of the world's citizens are immigrants. Where are they?
About 45 million or so are in the United States and Canada. If you include Mexico, probably 47.
This is foreign-born.
Foreign-born people who have lived in a different country than the one in which they were born for more than a year.
And legal or illegal?
Legal or illegal. In most instances, illegals are not counted. In the United States, we count them. We actually have a terrific methodology. That's why perhaps we have so many arguments about that. So let's say 45, 47 million in North America. About 50 or so million, roughly the same number, in the EU, the European Union space. That I will include Switzerland and Norway. In other words, not just the EU member states, but the larger economic area.
Now, but back up for a moment, because you said we were good at counting the unauthorized or undocumented. How good are the Europeans at counting them?
They refuse to count them.
So will the number be larger than the 50 million?
Most observers agree that there is something between 6 to 8 million illegals in the original EU 15, because it's difficult to count them, let's say, in the new additions to the European Union, the Polands, et cetera, the methodology, the capacity is not there. So perhaps 8 to 10 million more for Europe. Asia is probably at least as large as Europe, possibly a little larger than that. And the rest, sort of the rest of the world, Africa 10 to 15 million, South America 10 to 15 million, and before you know it, you get to 200.
Well, I'm surprised to ask. I should ask about Europe, but I have to ask about Africa. Who's moving to Africa?
Well, it's not who is moving to Africa from outside. It's, Africans moving within Africa.
And where are they moving to?
And they're moving to the, as you would imagine, to the places that are slightly better off.
So this is South Africa.
South Africa has a fairly large, some were difficult to measure, somewhere between 5 and 8 or 10 million, which is much larger on a per capita basis than the United States or most other places.
And a terrible burden on that country.
And a terrible burden on that country, but also the countries that typically are doing better, including your Nigerias. And interestingly enough, a lot of the countries in North Africa, the Maghreb countries, because these are people who move there and they get stuck there.
Fascinating. Let's go back to Europe for a second. Are there some patterns? I had the impression that at least in the early years, the former colonial countries were the feeders. Is that still the case, or has that shifted?
To a certain degree, it's still the case, but it is now we have new additions which are just about from everywhere, and migration flows start the typical way, the same way everywhere. So you have a lot of Afghans, for instance, and a lot of other Central Asians in Europe, and this started, of course, with sort of refugee flows, in the 1970s. And you know how the system is, the more they come, the more they bring along.
They write to their cousin and they say, I have a great job and a car, even if they're exaggerating a little bit. And
right,
the cousin
and
comes.
the streets are paved, of gold, from
that's
gold,
for
and
sure.
the Americans or the Germans don't really bend down to pick up the single bills. It has to be a 5-year bill before they actually bend down.
Sure,
of
of
course, we're
course.
exaggerating, but
Now, I picture for America, it's relatively easy to come, and at least it used to be, and we'll talk about that later, by just crossing the border.
quite
one
so.
way. But Europe, it occurs to me, there aren't that many easy borders to cross. So, and you mentioned the illegal or undocumented immigrants. How do they get in?
Well, illegal immigrants make it into Europe through 2 routes. The first one is using the Mediterranean Sea, which they often call, sort of like the river, because it's become it used to be fairly easy to cross. Okay? So it's their Rio Grande, if you will. The other route that has been and continues to be a very large route into Europe is from the eastern parts of Europe. So, and there, a lot of the people who wanted to come, to the major European economies would first try to have a beachhead, as it were, in the Czech Republic, and in Poland and all that. And when the European Union expanded to incorporate all of these countries, Ukraine and all of this next, if you will, line of countries, became the favorite places to stop over and typically get stuck there in terms of the largest number. But you constantly have, a group of people who make it, 1 at a time, 5 at a time, 60 at a time, in the back of trucks, on freighters,
And these are
1 at a time,
Somalis.
from all over the world. Southeast Asians, the biggest, newest flows are, the Bangladeshis, and the Pakistanis, and the Afghans, from anything that is to the west of these countries. Give you one example, including, in which I will use Russia. Russia really did not have, I'm not going to include the intra-USSR movement, did not really have many non-USSR citizens in its midst. When the USSR fell apart, it ended up, with perhaps about 1 million or so foreigners in Moscow. In, let's say, the end of the last century, we're talking about 2 or 3 million. Now, Russia, in terms of absolute numbers, has the 2nd largest number of immigrants other than the United States,
My
between
goodness.
12 and 14 million.
But these are from the former Soviet states?
No, these are primarily people from beyond that. Some
Beyond that.
people from the former Soviet Union, but beyond that. So it's not only the Tajiks and the Uzbekis, etc., but people beyond there. So what you see is essentially, I don't know what you may call it, but sort of an acceleration at the pace at which people are moving, number one. And number two, phenomena that used to take, a generation or two to build up.
Such as?
Such as, even think of Greeks to America, Armenians to America, Asians to America. Now take place within a decade or so. Rather remarkable.
Why is the difference in speed?
Primarily because you have created in all of these countries, whether in the periphery of the rich countries or in the rich countries, essentially economies that are split between formal sectors and informal sectors. The formal sectors continue to have, all of the nice things that formal sectors offer, wages, protections, etc., etc., etc. But the informal, the underground economy keeps growing, even in the most organized societies of Western Europe, or for that matter, in Russia.
And so this is like a magnet.
This is a magnet. The growth of the underground economy in all societies is a major magnet for newcomers.
Now, one wonders what is cause and what is effect.
Well, it's a very difficult, sort of thing to say, judgment to make. Part of it is that, sort of like the path breakers, make it there, and whether they say plenty of things to do here, have a car or whatever, or their jobs here, okay, they quickly begin to reconstitute their family, sometimes their villages, etc., into a new colony, if you will, okay? The other part is really as societies become richer, okay? Young people don't really want to do the jobs, some of the jobs that, still have to be done. Somebody still has to hew the wood and draw the water. And it makes no difference, whether you're in Russia or whether you're in Germany or you're in the United States.
Let me press you a little bit on that.
Please.
I wonder if it's that or it's that abetted by low birth rates of native peoples.
I don't need to be pressed on this. If you look at fertility rates in much of Europe, including the newest additions to the European Union, okay, including Russia. Take Russia, for instance. Not only does it have a very low birth rate, fertility rate, but you have, longevity.
Tremendous mortality
problems are remarkable. The average Russian will live 20 years less than the average European. So what you have there is...
Which is a change since the fall of communism.
Correct.
Actually, it started before the fall of communism.
It started before. We didn't, one has to worry about wonder about the statistics under the previous regimes. The other thing, environmental factors, degradation has been taking a toll in terms of, health outcomes.
So the immigrants are being sucked in partly because of the economy, but also... My colleague Ben Wattenberg once said the birth dearth, which is now worldwide. So every society needs, or most societies now just need more people to keep the infrastructure running.
Yeah, Ben has been right, for 20 years, as you know, when he coined the phrase, has been right all along. In some places, you have what I call a double squeeze play, which is we're getting older, except you and I, of course, which means, that a lot of us will be leaving the labor market, the labor force, sooner rather than later, which means that somebody has to take our place and
pay our Social
Security. And the pipeline is simply not beefy enough, strong enough in many places, okay? But in some places like the United States, and increasingly many other parts of the world, will grow the economy by growing the labor force, the actual number of people in the labor force. Well, we reproduce ourselves enough to replace us who move on, but if you want to grow the labor force, you have to draw from somewhere else.
So this must make the Europeans somewhat ambivalent. I must say I've walked the streets of Geneva, and I feel as if I'm at the United Nations.
Ambivalent is a very kind word. What we're talking about here is change. Change that is visible, that is literally happening in front of people's eyes, I mean in real time. And it is cultural, it is social, it is racial, and in the past decade or so we've become much more conscious of the fact that religious distance is also become a major issue.
In Europe.
In Europe. So what you see is people who say, how did this neighborhood, my neighborhood, change in the matter of 8 or 10 years? And excuse me, but who made these decisions? Was I consulted? The political parties, fight an election based on what to do in terms of openings to immigration or not.
This is the most striking thing, that this is happening now in some countries we'll get to Asia in a moment, where there seems to be more of an invitation. But this is striking in our country, in the U.S. and in Europe. This is almost like a force of nature.
It is like a force of nature. I think, which of course in policy terms, the smart thing, and you know, countries, governments haven't quite figured it out yet, is how you channel it, how you manage it. Not at the margins, but manage it in a conscious way, rather than simply either give up, deny it, okay, or what?
Now, to manage it, the first thing is you need some control over the borders, or whatever it is. Now, in Europe, it seems as if there are some institutional reasons why that's difficult. Travel between the EU countries now is quite easy. And if you can slip in from the east, well, then you're in.
Very much so. And what Europe has been trying to do for the past 10 or 15 years, and it's in an embryonic stage so far, realizing that as internal controls have disappeared.
What is an internal control?
Crossing from Poland to Germany, okay? While those borders, have sort of disappeared, the only smart, in terms of governance, thing to do is to try to sort of harden, if you will, your borders with non-member states of the European Union. And that has been very difficult. And here is where, in one sense, everybody's trying to learn from everybody else, which typically translates, and here I will exaggerate, typically translates into importing, methodologies that have already failed in the United States.
We'll talk about those in a minute. But I think it's also the case, this is another failed policy in the United States, I think it's also the case that many people enter a country with a visa and then just disappear.
Yes. In Europe, and I presume in most other parts of the world, the front door, the front gate, through a visa is the premier way through which people sort of come into the countries and then they stay on, because nobody has the capacity to sort of trying to figure out where people are in order to remove them.
It must be possible, however, since my credit card company seems to know where I am at all times of the day and night.
Yes, it is. There is one big difference, however. You don't mind being found out, by your credit card and having your credit card knowing where it is, where you are. If you escape those kinds of the easiest, the most visible ways of having somebody know where you are, if you live in an underground economy, if you live in an ethnic community, if you do not use any of these identifiers, it becomes fairly easy to disappear. Now, not in every country. In Europe, everybody has a national ID. And some countries have something that takes you one step beyond that, which is a registry, which means if you're in Denmark, let's say, and you move apartments or jobs or whatever it is, the authorities get notified. That goes beyond simply having to carry a national ID. And if you're in a small country, enforcement, trying to figure out where you are and perhaps remove you becomes easier. If you're in a large country, like France, like Germany, it becomes, of course, more difficult.
Now, my impression of the situation in Japan and Korea is that it isn't post, but there are government decisions being made about letting people in. What can we learn from those countries?
Well, these societies are particularly well organized, and in terms of ethnicity and looks, etc., they're fairly monolithic.
And very low birth rates.
Low birth rates, and the low birth rates for so long that demographers tell us that we haven't really experienced anything like that in the history of the mankind. Because what is happening if you have a generation of two and you're not producing sort of the average number of babies? What is happening is an implosion happens.
And this
few
is
women,
happening there.
and it's already happening.
So what policies are Japan and Korea following?
Korea have very active immigration policy.
From where? Where do they want people?
From essentially the region. Also, although they're a little worried about, exactly where,
I take it they would prefer Chinese to Japanese.
They would prefer Chinese to Japanese, exactly right. But they're doing systematically, and interestingly enough, they're not just looking at workers, but they're looking at prospective citizens, which is a very American way of looking at immigration.
Now, is this going to be a model that we should think about for other countries if they could control their borders?
If they could control their borders, it's not a bad idea, because that puts the society and the government in charge of who and who comes in, under what circumstances, how they change statuses, etc., etc.
So, not to oversimplify, but we're running out of time. We've identified two competing models here. One a more organized model, and one a post hoc model. Let's just put it that way. Let me ask you to put your prognosticator's hat on. So 25, 50 years from now, what does immigration look like? What does the world look like?
Well, the more immigration is going to be the way that, you have to think about it. Hopefully, more legal immigration, in other words, organized immigration, and societies that are much more diverse. And all of the societies will continue to struggle with finding sort of like that perfect, just milieu of how you do integration, how do you work together, you live together.
Well, we'll talk about the U.S. later, but I'm puzzled by a diverse Germany. I can remember, I'm going to speak personally, watching the Olympic figure skating. It was probably 3 Olympics ago. And it was a black woman, but she was a German. And I said to myself, she can't be a German, she must be an American. Now, I was fully prepared to think of a black American, right? But I was not ready to think of a black German. Help me.
Yes. Change has happened in Germany in terms of color, the color barrier, primarily, of course, because of the American military, the soldiers, etc., etc. Germany requires people to choose, whether to have the one nationality or the other one. There's no dual nationality. So, at least on paper, in legal terms, this black woman that you saw was German, not American. She has had to renounce officially her Americanness, although she could always get it back if she tried. Okay? This is something that the Germans have had to think very hard about, and they have, in a sense, split into a double personality. Everybody but Turks is pretty much okay. If you're a Turk, perhaps a Moroccan, because they have some Maghrebians in Germany too, then that's a different
What's
issue.
wrong with the Turks?
Well, religion is the major thing.
Is that
for
the
them.
thing?
The thing is religion. It's the effects of a misguided policy that goes back 30, 40, 50 years
This
ago.
is the guest worker?
The guest worker programs.
Why was it misguided?
Because Germany failed to understand early enough that these people were there to stay, and to make the investments both in terms of teaching the public, in terms of the language that the government uses, in terms of the investments that they make, in integration, like to learn the language, etc., to include these people as possibly prospective citizens. Until the end of the last century, you would have major arguments in the German press with the government constantly arguing that these people don't belong here, they're temporary here, we didn't ask them to be here and live here forever, and we should be preparing them to go back. That's truly a lost opportunity for Germany.
Permanently lost?
No. It is remarkable to observe that the same conservative governments that were doing all of those mistakes, until the late 1990s, have been particularly smart since 2005.
Now, why is that?
Because they basically saw the writing in the wall. The number of first and second and third generation, German Turks, Germans, etc., kept growing.
And do they vote?
And they vote, but not nearly at the rates that they vote in our countries. So they basically realized that for security reasons, for, sort of what they call social cohesion reasons, for smartness reasons, they had to actually begin to accept the fact that they had become, again, a polyethnic society, and they needed to keep the society together by building a society that is more inclusive. And they have done remarkable progress in a remarkably short period of time.
Oh, that's a terrific way to end the program. So, Demetrios, I just want to thank you so much for being with us, and I look forward to our next program.
It's my pleasure, Doug. I've enjoyed this.
And to our viewing audience, let me say thank you for tuning in to Policy Watch, and if you have any questions, comments, or complaints, you can write to us at policywatch@UMD, that's UMD for University of Maryland, .edu. Thanks again for being with us, and Demetrios, thank you again.
My pleasure.
This program was produced by the University of Maryland, which is solely responsible for its content.
The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland.
We are PBS.